nervous system notes, and we're going to start with the neuron, which is often described as the building block of the nervous system. So the nervous system is made up of lots of different kinds of cells, and the neuron itself is the most basic type of cell we have to cause communication throughout the brain. A single cell is called a neuron, a single nerve cell, and it's the building block of the nervous system. And if you have a bunch of neurons together, a bundle of them is referred to as a nerve, which I'm sure you've heard of, a nerve, or a tract. You have about 100 billion nerve cells or neurons in your brain. And there are different types of neurons that have different jobs. So let's take a look at some of the different kinds of neurons that we have. So there are four major types. First, we have afferent or sensory neurons. And afferent or sensory neurons send input to the brain from your senses. Afferent means they go to the brain. And so like if you touch something hot, that signal would send a message to your brain. That's a sensory signal going to your brain. Efferent neurons are in charge of your motor responses, movement. And this sends output from the brain to your muscles in order to move them. So if you touch something hot, afferent neurons send the input to your brain, and then your brain sends efferent neurons down to your hand to move it away. So the sensory neurons tell the brain this is hot. The motor neurons tell your hand to move. We also have what are known as interneurons, and between, these connect your different types of neurons that we've talked about already, the sensory and the motor neurons. And then another type of neuron that is described in our chapter are relatively recently discovered, and they're called mirror neurons. Pretty amazing what they are presumed to do. So mirror neurons, not only are they involved in doing things, but also when we watch someone else do something, the mirror neurons in our brain will essentially mentally do what they're doing to mirror their behavior. So if you saw someone tying their shoe, let's say you were demonstrating how to tie your shoe to a child, the child will, using their mirror neurons, will be mentally doing that in their brain, in their mind. So this is seen as an important part of communication with other people. It helps us to be more empathetic, it's presumed, and we're only just starting to really learn about the role of interneurons. So when it comes to neurons, this is a diagram that's going to show us some of the things that the neuron is made up of. In the upper left here, you see the cell body. That's this part right here. And right in the middle is the nucleus where you have your DNA. This is your cell body, and here is your nucleus. Then you have branching out from the cell body are these structures called dendrites. They almost look like trees with branches. And dendrite comes from the Greek word dendros, which I believe means tree. And your dendrites, these receive messages from neighboring neurons. The axon is this long part here, and this carries a message from one neuron down along the axon to the neighboring neuron. the axon is covered with what's known as a myelin sheath. It's a kind of a white, fatty covering. It's shown in yellow here, but it's generally more whitish. And it helps the messages go more quickly. It speeds transmission of messages. When someone has multiple sclerosis, that's caused by a breakdown in the myelin, also known as demyelination, and it interrupts the messages from getting sent properly. So it carries down along the axon, and then it reaches what's called the axon terminal. That's these little tiny things at the end. These are the axon terminals, and this is where you see the release of neurotransmitters. More on them later, neurotransmitters. Let's zoom in to like right around here to see where the neurotransmitters are released. So we're going to take this little rectangle here and zoom in on it. So there is the axon terminal from a neuron. It comes off of the axon, and in the end of the axon terminal, this is where neurotransmitters are released into this gap here. This gap is called a synapse. So let's keep going. Other types of cells, more on that in a moment, by the way. Other types of cells that we need to know about, other than simply neurons, are what are called glial cells. And glial cells, these don't send messages, they support the neuron's activities. And you have a lot more of these than you do neurons, about 3 to 10 times more of them. And your glial cells, this is what forms the myelin sheath, and therefore the glial cells help to speed up transmission of messages. Okay, so let's see what happens down at the level of the axon terminal and the synapse. The synapse is the space between, this is the axon terminal here, and this part over here, this is the dendrite of the neighboring neuron. So it crosses from the axon terminal into the synapse and makes its way over to the dendrite of the neighboring cell. So these little red dots represent neurotransmitters. They come out into the synapse and then they lock into receptors on the neighboring dendrite. Okay, so after it binds with the adjacent or neighboring neuron, two things happen. Two things can happen. One thing that can happen to those neurotransmitters, they can be broken down by enzymes. The other thing that can happen is what's known as reuptake. Reuptake by the neuron that released it. Otherwise, you'd have too much of the neurotransmitter in your synapse, and that would cause all kinds of problems. Let's get a better look at what happens when neurotransmitters go from one neuron to the next. So this is an illustration to see that. And here's the axon terminal. Sometimes it's known as a terminal button. And in the axon terminal, you have these little holders that hold on to neurotransmitters. Those are presynaptic vesicles, presynaptic, before the synapse. So these hold different neurotransmitters. Here's another one right here. And then the neurotransmitter, when the cell gets the message to release, sends neurotransmitters out into the synapse. All right. Remember, two things can happen. After it makes its way across and goes into to the receptor of the neighboring neuron, this is the dendrite of another neuron right here. After it goes in here, it doesn't go into this neuron. This neurotransmitter here kind of goes into the receptor right here and then back out into the synapse. You have about not quite 100 different types of neurotransmitters, but each one has a receptor and only one receptor that it fits. So there are different receptors for different neurotransmitters. So for this neurotransmitter, it goes into that receptor and then tells this neuron what to do, and then it goes back into the synapse. They can't stay there because you'll build up too much of this neurotransmitter, and that could cause all kinds of different problems depending on what the neurotransmitter is and how much extra of that chemical you have. So one thing that can happen, I mentioned earlier, the neurotransmitters can be broken down by enzymes, or, and here's some illustration of them going into the receptors, or the neurotransmitter can go back into the neuron that sent it through the process of reuptake. Neurotransmitter reuptake. That means it goes from the synapse back to where it came from. Probably the most complex aspect of the neurotransmitter is how it actually fires. This is something that you see occasionally. Well, not occasionally. Usually you'll see a question based on this next slide about the neural impulse on the AP test. So you have fluid inside and outside of the axon. And in the fluid, you're going to have electrically charged particles, and maybe you remember from chemistry, those are called ions. And when that neuron is at rest, inside the axon, here's our axon. It's illustrated here as like a tube, just for illustration purposes. So this fluid inside the axon, when it's just kind of hanging out, not doing anything, it's negative. It's negatively charged. But outside the axon, it's positive. What do you call it when you have a negative charge faced with a positive charge? When you have two different types of charges, it's called polarization. And this creates what's known as, in neurotransmitter speak, resting potential. All right, it's a particular voltage level, a negative charge that gives that neuron the potential to fire. Once it gets the message to to fire, we call this an action potential. And that's when you have these the positive charges go inside the axon and go down the axon, and we call that the action potential as it's firing. And then when it gets to the end, two things can happen. It can either fire or not fire. This is known as the all or nothing principle. Neurons don't fire in gradations. They don't fire a little bit or a lot. They either fire or they don't. And this is all based on what messages that neuron is receiving from the neurotransmitters that it gets. Now, there are some neurotransmitters that we definitely need to know the names of and what they do. As I said, there are, let's just roughly say, around 100 neurotransmitters that have been discovered. And some of them are more important to psychologists than others. Every neurotransmitter does many, many things. They never have just one job. So we'll be simplifying to an extent here, but suffice it to say that each neurotransmitter does many different things. So acetylcholine, this is an important neurotransmitter for learning. It's heavily involved in learning, but it also keeps your heart from beating too fast. This might help you understand why certain drugs have side effects that we don't want. A side effect being an effect that the drug has that is unintended. It's not what the drug was designed to do, but it happens anyway. Often this is because of the drugs aren't specific enough, or it's really hard to make drugs that only affect one aspect of a neurotransmitter. So if you're taking something that alters your acetylcholine level, you'll probably also have to be either monitored closely for your heart or maybe even take another medication for your heart. Acetylcholine, because it's so strongly linked with learning, it's not surprising that it also plays a major role in Alzheimer's disease. Most people are familiar with what Alzheimer's disease is. It's a form of dementia. Some of the earliest signs when a person has Alzheimer's disease is memory loss, especially short-term memory loss. People may forget something they said a minute ago or 30 seconds ago. And that's largely because of acetylcholine. And Alzheimer's treatments often affect acetylcholine levels. Another important neurotransmitter is called GABA. That stands for, you don't need to know what it stands for, but I'll tell you anyway. It's gamma aminobutyric acid. GABA. And GABA is what's known as an inhibitor. It's a calming neurotransmitter. You'll see that involved in when you drink alcohol, tons and tons of GABA gets released. That's why people get relaxed when they drink alcohol. Serotonin's another one you may probably have heard of. Serotonin plays a role in things like mood regulation, but it also plays a role in sleep, plays a role in aggression and appetite. So that's a wide range of things, obviously. Most people, if they do know about serotonin, it's because it is often the target of many antidepressant drugs. Serotonin is definitely related to depression. And the drugs that, the most recent drugs over the last few decades target serotonin, among some other neurotransmitters, but serotonin is almost always one of the targets of the latest medications. Dopamine is another big one. We'll be hearing about that a lot more this year. We'll hear about it when we learn about drugs. We'll hear about it when we learn about why people overeat. Dopamine, we'll even hear about it when we talk about schizophrenia later in the year. Dopamine is involved in learning, also attention, movement, and importantly, the reward system. The reward system is a series of structures and areas in your brain that are activated when you do something that is pleasing, and it makes you remember that thing. So this is probably one of the best examples of a neurotransmitter that does many different things. So therefore, it's going to be playing a role in some things that don't seem to have much in common. It plays a major role in schizophrenia, in Parkinson's disease, which is characterized by involuntary body movements and tremors, and addiction. It's involved in addiction. So easily one of the most complex neurotransmitters. And then finally, there's norepinephrine. Norepinephrine is another important neurotransmitter for psychologists. It's involved in things like eating, alertness, and sleep. Kind of like serotonin in some ways, at least in terms of the effects that it has. And many antidepressant drugs will target serotonin and norepinephrine. And so this one is also linked with depression. And then one more, and this is technically, it's not technically a neurotransmitter, but it functions much like one, and these are called endorphins. Endorphins are what are known as neuropeptides. So they're not neurotransmitters, but they have similar things. Endorphins are your body's natural painkillers. If you get an injury, you will often get a rush of endorphins that will lessen the pain, so you can then therefore deal with that pain. And endorphins actually use the same receptors in your brain as morphine. And when people become addicted to opiates like morphine or heroin or OxyContin, things like that, their body will probably stop producing as much endorphins as it needs, and may not produce really much endorphins at all. And you need endorphins. Even when you're not feeling pain, you need endorphins. Endorphins also cause a feeling of euphoria. It's a feeling of pleasure that people can get. So it's it's very similar to neurotransmitters, although chemically slightly different. All right. And then finally, as we talk about the nervous system, we're going to look at the major branches of the nervous system itself. To wrap it up, so we started with the neurons, the building blocks, and now we're going to see, what did those building blocks actually build? They built your nervous system. All right. So if a neuron is like a Lego, your nervous system is like the Harry Potter Hogwarts castle made out of those Legos. Okay. So the nervous system is kind of like it branches out into various substructures. The most basic division is your central nervous system on the one hand, and your peripheral nervous system on the other. The central nervous system, everyone's heard of that, I'm sure. The central nervous system consists of two very important things, your brain and your spinal cord. And we'll talk more about them, much more about the brain later. But just right now, a very brief introduction and a very brief general overview of the brain in this section, but much more of it later in the unit. So the brain, what can you say about it? Well, that's a cross section of a brain down the middle. That right there would be the right hemisphere of a brain, and you can see lots of the internal structures of it. Okay, so what do we know about the brain in really basic terms? One thing we know is that higher structures in the brain, literally like the parts of your brain that are like physically higher up, especially the wrinkle part, those are involved in more complex functions. Like what? Like complex movement, like memory, like language, high-level thinking, planning, decision-making, carrying out orders, all sorts of things that we consider to be like very sophisticated. Down at the bottom, the lower structures, which is this is something we would call the brain stem. You've heard of the brain stem, I'm sure. That's involved with more basic functions, things that we need to survive, like breathing, whether we're alert or not, heartbeat, things like that. Okay, and then your spinal cord is the other part of your central nervous system, and it relays information to and from the brain. So that's how your brain gets information from your body. It goes from your spinal cord to the brain, and then other things can go to your brain, from your brain to other parts of your body. And you see these what look like little veins and stuff. These are nerves, and these represent your peripheral nervous system. All right, this represents your how the spinal cord sends information to the brain and from the brain, and then it sends it out through these nerves. Like if you wanted to raise your arm, it would go off the spinal cord out to these nerves, etc. So if your central nervous system is your brain and spinal cord, what's the peripheral nervous system? Well, it's everything else. Everything else about your nervous system. It's like all the nerves that connect from your brain and spinal cord to the rest of your body, including your internal organs. So let's look at the peripheral nervous system now. Peripheral, meaning, off to the side. So we have one major division. The major division of the peripheral nervous system is the somatic nervous system and the autonomic nervous system. These are probably new terms for most people. These aren't words you find in everyday language. They really only come up when talking about like brain anatomy or nervous system anatomy. So let's look at what the difference between the somatic and the autonomic nervous system are. The somatic nervous system, this responds to and acts on the outside world. In other words, it's under voluntary control. When you do something on purpose, that's coming through your somatic nervous system. And it involves sensory neurons and motor neurons. That example where, you touch something hot and then you move your hand away, that involves sensory and motor neurons. Well, that's your somatic nervous system telling your brain and then getting the message to move. All right, so that's voluntary control. The autonomic nervous system, this is so-called automatic processes. Now, I get how this could be confusing. Autonomic and automatic are very kind of close, both in spelling and in what they mean. Autonomic, you can sort of think of it as meaning the automatic nervous system, although don't call it that because it's not its name. The autonomic nervous system has two main subdivisions. All right, what are those subdivisions? They are, and these are the last subdivisions. Autonomic's made up of the sympathetic nervous system and the so-called parasympathetic. Sorry for the C kind of got cut off from the end, but I think you can get it. You can see what I mean by that. So the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous systems are part of the autonomic. This is involuntary stuff. These are things that basically go on kind of behind the scenes without your conscious awareness. The sympathetic nervous system, its most famous and well-known responsibility is the so-called fight or flight response. You're faced with an emergency or some sort of crisis situation, and I'm not sure who made up that phrase fight or flight, but it kind of sums it up. You can either engage with the emergency or you can run away from it. All right. So if if you saw a scary movie and it made you jump, or someone like jumped out from behind a corner and startled you, that's your fight or flight response. Or if the alarm bells go off at school and we have an evacuation, that could be, maybe you get nervous, and that would be your fight or flight response going off. All right. Now, the fight or flight response is great, and it works automatically for getting you ready for action. It sends blood to your organs so you can run or fight. It gets you more oxygen. All right, your heart beats fast. You get plenty of blood and oxygen. But what about when the emergency's over? Well, you also need to have your parasympathetic nervous system. Your parasympathetic nervous system is active a lot more often. It's controlling normal things in the background, like your digestive system, your immune system, your blood flowing through your body. All of that sort of stuff is done by the parasympathetic nervous system. But it also is in charge of calming you down after you have an emergency. So when you get all hyped up from the fight or flight response and your sympathetic nervous system, your parasympathetic nervous system calms you down and brings you back to kind of homeostasis, you could say. All right. So that is our overview of the nervous system, including neurons and neurotransmitters and the branches of the nervous system. And the rest of the unit will be focusing on different areas of the brain and studying the brain. All right. So thank you for watching.